This is the Doomsday Clock, a concept developed by atomic scientists in 1947. It shows us how close we are to the worst war humanity could ever experience. This war will use the most powerful weaponry human genius has ever created – bombs fueled by the power of the atom. The clock is set by the Board of Atomic Scientists and Nobel laureates every year. The closer the hand of the clock is to midnight, the closer we are to nuclear war. Today, the clock is the closest to global catastrophe it has ever been, only 90 seconds to midnight. Even during the Cold War, at the highest point of an escalation in 1984, it showed 2 minutes to midnight. More dictatorship countries, such as Iran, are on the edge of obtaining nuclear weapons. Meanwhile, Russia and North Korea threaten to use nukes almost weekly. The deathly breath of atomic war is as close as never before. This unstable situation raises questions about our future and survival. How can the war start? Who will take part in it? Can we prevent the war? This is what we'll try to understand. To understand which countries are going to be involved in a nuclear war, we must first understand which countries obtain a nuclear arsenal, their enemies, and their readiness to use their weapons. At the moment, only a few countries have nuclear arsenals. They are Russia with 5,899 warheads, the United States with 5,224 warheads, China with 410, France with 290, the United Kingdom with 225, Pakistan with 170, India with 164, North Korea with 30, and possibly Israel with approximately 90 warheads. Israel neither confirmed nor refuted that it has nuclear weapons. Also, Iran might be really close to obtaining such weapons. The majority of these countries are now in some sort of conflict with each other. India has slow-paced border conflicts with Pakistan and China. These conflicts could escalate, but it's unlikely they'll use nuclear weapons. These countries have a lot of people and not enough land. If they use nuclear weapons, the land they want will become polluted. Also, the radiation from the explosion can spread to the country that used the weapon, making their own land unlivable. Losing more habitable land would be a big problem for these countries. The Iranian government claims to destroy Israel if it gets nuclear weapons, but if Iran launches the nukes, Israel would most likely respond right away with everything they have. This response would destroy Iran, so these claims are still just claims for now. The most plausible scenario is a Russian attack on NATO countries and Ukraine. At the moment, Russia is in a state of war with Ukraine, which is supported by NATO allied countries. Also, Russia threatens to attack its nearest European neighbors. These include Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Poland. Russia's aim for this attack is to divide NATO by aiming at the smallest and most vulnerable countries that, in Russia's opinion, are not worth fighting for. They might invade small countries and threaten all the others so they would not interfere. As an alternative, Russia might even send nukes to the UK, which is one of the most proactive members of NATO. By this attack, they might literally take down the big guy who was willing to protect the others. The problem for Russia with these NATO scenarios is that although they are very rewarding, they are also very risky. A direct attack on NATO would cause very severe consequences by the NATO nuclear retaliation strikes. NATO countries might give Russia a response it was not waiting for, to stand strong together rather than each country being on its own. This is why Russia might pick to stage a nuclear provocation against a less protected enemy, Ukraine. Most likely, Russia might make a nuclear attack on Ukrainian territory, which is already occupied by Russia. It will still cause casualties in the EU countries and signal the whole world that Russia is a big threat and everyone should just give up. But there will be fewer chances for Russia itself to be burned down to the ground by the retaliation strike. Here's how Russia might do it. On June 6, 2023, Russia destroyed the Kakhovka Dam on the Dnipro River. The dam explosion was a disaster with destructive consequences comparable to a nuclear strike. It left nearly 700,000 Ukrainians without water. It flooded over 4,000 households and killed hundreds or possibly thousands of people. It destroyed the entire region's ecosystem, made hundreds of square kilometers uninhabitable, and raised global crop prices. Besides that, the explosion had just one more, less obvious consequence. 140 kilometers up the river is the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. It is now captured by Russians. This power plant fills its cooling reservoirs with river water. After the dam explosion, the river levels dropped to a critical point, leaving the reservoir with too little water for cooling. If the reservoir loses more water, the cooling system might stop working, leading to the reactors overheating and eventually meltdown. A meltdown happens when the nuclear fuel gets so hot that it melts. If melted nuclear fuel gets down to the cooling water, the water will turn to steam and expand so fast that it will explode. The blast will scatter the nuclear fuel for tens of kilometers. The radioactive cloud could quickly reach Europe, killing people with radiation and cancer. It's very hard to cause a meltdown of modern nuclear reactors just by reducing the cooling water levels. Here is where explosives come into play. According to the International Atomic Energy Agency, the Russians stored the explosives on the plant's site. They also constantly stage provocations on the plant's territory. The International Atomic Energy Agency team continues to report hearing military activities, including explosions, small arms fire, as well as outgoing artillery fire from near the plant. According to the International Atomic Energy Agency director Rafael Grossi, the situation remains unpredictable. Russians have already set up everything they need to cause a meltdown by destroying the dam and delivering the explosives that can be used to destroy the reactor's cooling system. One last step left to start a meltdown is to detonate explosives to damage the cooling system. Then they will blame it on Ukraine and so-called Western countries. These actions of Russia showed the intention to damage the environment as much as possible, making it uninhabitable and causing Ukraine and the EU to retreat and give up territories. During this war with Ukraine, Russia has shown that it always raises the stakes and never backs down. Russia has used all the escalation cards up its sleeve. From now on, it has no other way to escalate other than a nuclear scenario. Russian commanders hoped the whole world would be afraid to launch retaliation strikes. Thus, stepping back would give Russia a chance to crush democracies and invade more countries with no resistance. As we know it from history, the Russian occupation of democracies will lead to total genocide of the local population, tortures, and millions of deaths. So, what's stopping Russia from committing another war crime? Suppose Russia starts a nuclear attack. They could do it by launching a rocket or by exploding the atomic power plant. In that case, the future will depend on the leaders of the USA, the UK, and France. According to NATO's deterrence policy, they must decide whether to launch a nuclear or non-nuclear response. Or they must choose to surrender and let Russia to set up a new world order of nuclear terrorism. In this world, any country that gets nuclear weapons can invade others and dictate the world order. They can do this just by threatening to nuke those who disagree. If NATO fights Russia back, even with conventional weapons, it might lead to one of two consequences. First, if NATO's counterattack succeeds, it might stop Russia forever by destroying all its launch pads, naval ports, weapon plants, and economy. The ideal outcome is that Russia loses all its weapons, weapon-making facilities, and technologies. It would become a demilitarized country and have no desire to start wars or weapons to fight with. Second, if NATO's counterattack fails, Putin or whoever will be in command might launch a nuclear response. As a small bonus for Russia, its proxies North Korea and Belarus might also join the nuclear attack. Russian military doctrine says the Russian Federation reserves the right to use the nuclear weapons in response to the use of nuclear and other types of weapons of mass destruction, against it and/or its allies, as well as in the event of aggression against the Russian Federation using conventional weapons when the very existence of the state is threatened. The decision to use nuclear weapons is made by the President of the Russian Federation. This means Russia doesn't mind using nukes against what they see as an aggression. This includes the defense of other countries against Russian attacks, and this might launch a vicious cycle of nuclear strikes all around the globe. In a case if Russia chooses total war, they would launch everything they have in their arsenal. In that case, that's a one-way ticket, and there will be no Earth as we know it. The Earth will become a wasteland. It will be covered with dark radioactive clouds of nuclear winter. The ones who will survive the war will be destined to die inside the bunkers, as there will be nothing left outside. It will be dangerous to leave the bunker. But everyone likes to live, Putin does too, so this scenario is the least likely to happen. It is more likely that Russia would choose to limit the attack to the most critical targets inside the enemy's territory. This would bring chaos and disable its enemy, but it will not wipe out the planet's entire population. Russia would use the combined attack of its so-called nuclear triad. It would launch many rockets from the ground, sea, and air, overwhelming the enemy's air defense and making them unable to respond. Russia would launch medium-range missiles to attack Europe. They would also use intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, to attack further countries. The rockets would be launched from silos, trucks, and trains hidden all over the country, from the Ukrainian border to the deep forests of Siberia. They will fly through space to reach the areas deep inside the enemy's territory. Short and medium-range cruise missiles will be launched from the bombers. They will fly very low and change their path to hide from the enemy's radars. Warships and submarines, the locations of which are kept secret, will launch intercontinental ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. At high altitudes, the explosion can destroy communications, planes, low-orbit satellites, and air defense systems. Russia would hit targets on the ground, including docks, airfields, navy bases, crucial government buildings, power plants, and oil refineries. To cause chaos and send the country back to the Stone Age, Russia would destroy data centers, microchip production facilities, and the headquarters of leading food retailers. These explosions will cause high troops and civilian casualties. Underground blasts would be aimed to destroy the most protected strategic commands and control bunkers, anti-ballistic missile systems, and nuclear missile silos. Also, Russia would target the US nuclear arsenals deployed in other countries, such as Italy, Belgium, Germany, and the Netherlands. The potential map of Russian strikes would look like this in America and like this in Europe. Of course, this is a rough approximation. Still, it might be somewhat close to reality because of nuclear weapons' immense power and their vast numbers. Moreover, the current state of Russian intercontinental ballistic missiles remains unknown, as they are very resource-consuming rocket systems that require substantial investments to stay functional. Even after the Russian military budget increased in 2023 to around $100 billion, it was only 1/9 of the US budget, which was around $900 billion. Still, Russia has substantially more rockets to maintain. Poor missile maintenance may result in lower yield. Missiles may stay in silos, explode during the launch, fail to reach the target, and fall on Russian territory or the territory of the countries along the way. It might not even explode at all. The Doomsday Clock hits midnight. To attack the USA, Russia would likely use its intercontinental ballistic missiles as a primary weapon. Putin would use his nuclear briefcase to launch the rockets. The briefcase will connect to the strategic rocket forces, sending the launch code and the target's coordinates. In turn, the Strategic Rocket Forces Command will give direct orders to the crew to launch a rocket. When the rocket is launched, it enters the so-called boost phase, which lasts 3 to 5 minutes. The missile reaches the speed of about 7.8 km per second, which is almost 23 sound speeds. and has an altitude of 150 to 400 kilometers. The rocket is now in space. For about 25 minutes, the missile follows a suborbital spaceflight path. Halfway through this phase, it is at an altitude of around 1,200 kilometers. The missile may release several warheads and decoys, which anti-ballistic missile systems cannot intercept. The terminal phase lasts for 2 minutes and starts at an altitude of 100 kilometers. Now, the separate warheads are re-entering the Earth's atmosphere. The missile's payload will hit the target at up to 7 kilometers per second, or 20 sound speeds. The computer initiates the explosion sequence when the warhead reaches the needed altitude, which was specially chosen to increase damage to a target. The first conventional explosion compresses uranium or plutonium inside the warhead. It starts the uncontrollable fission process, which basically tears atoms apart. It releases immense energy, the equivalent of thousands of tons of explosives. This is a nuclear explosion. But that's not all. The nuclear blast creates immense pressure and heat, compressing heavy hydrogen in the warhead's heart. At the same time, the hydrogen is being bombarded with neutrons, the parts of the atoms turned by the nuclear explosion. This starts a new process, fusion. This process turns hydrogen into helium just like our sun. It releases far more energy than a nuclear explosion. This is a hydrogen explosion now. In a few thousandths of a second, a fireball with roughly a diameter of 1 kilometer appears. The temperature inside the fireball rises to tens of millions of degrees. This is the temperature inside the sun. Everything inside the fireball evaporates, including buildings, cars, and metal structures. The fireball emits the light of energy so high that everything that can burn in a radius of 11 kilometers starts to burn. If you look at the explosion, you'll be blind temporarily or forever. It depends on the distance from the blast. Flash blindness would likely cause traffic accidents and blocked roads. These will be far from the damage zones and may cause aircraft accidents. If your skin is exposed to this light, you will get severe burns. The fireball pushes the air outwards at immense speed. This creates a blast wave with a pressure of thousands of pounds per square inch, and a speed exceeding 1,300 kilometers per hour. The blast wave destroys everything within a radius of 6 kilometers. Most residential buildings collapse. Only reinforced concrete structures on the edge of the explosion radius can survive the blast wave. Within a radius of 18 kilometers, the blast wave becomes weaker as it loses its energy. But it can still break windows and cause injuries. This is especially true for people who come to a window after seeing a flash of the explosion. The blast wave can cause lung injuries, ear damage, and internal bleeding. The explosion also creates an electromagnetic pulse, a brief burst of electromagnetic energy. It impacts electronics through induced voltage and causes surges in long power lines near the detonation site. The electromagnetic pulse may disrupt electronics, but some AM and FM radios will still receive signals from the outside of the area. Most battery-powered equipment should work after turning it off and then on again. Unprotected equipment connected to the power line, like TVs, PCs, and consoles, may be damaged by a power surge. The surge can come up to tens of miles away from the blast. Radios will receive signals from outside the area. Power will likely be out. Repairable damage to power system components can occur several miles from the detonation. Electromagnetic pulse effects aren't strongly dependent on the yield or the height of the blast below 3 miles. Temporary power outages may extend beyond the blast damage area. Power system transformer damage from electromagnetic pulse is hard to repair quickly. It is usually limited to a few miles from ground zero. After the blast wave is gone, air from the outside rushes in. It creates a pillar of radioactive dust and debris. The pillar rises into the sky and forms a mushroom. The air rushes into the explosion area. It brings more oxygen, which fuels the fires that started after the explosion. It might create a firestorm at the place of the blast, thus creating a great danger to the survivors. Right after the explosion, tens of thousands are dead. Hundreds of thousands are badly injured with broken bones, severe burns, and cuts. The majority of these people would die because emergency services are paralyzed or cease to exist. Thousands are trapped in collapsed and burning buildings. The hospitals that already lack beds, medical personnel, and resources would quickly be overwhelmed by the number of victims, most of whom have burns. Stanford University radiologist and anti-nuclear activist Herbert Abrams estimated that because 80% of hospitals are in urban areas and would so be destroyed in the attack, there would be one bed for every 563 severely injured patients. Hospitals would face similar shortages after an attack. They would lack blood, plasma, and other fluids, drugs, and bandages. This would stop them from treating the wounded and patients with chronic illnesses. The consequences for the economy might be even worse. World supply chains would be disrupted. The country would not be able to import and export goods in the required volumes. There would be a shortage of all goods. It would start with food and end with metals. Land for farming and meat production would become scarce. World food production levels would plummet. This would immediately stop a huge part of the economy, cause a global shortage of all goods, and raise prices dramatically. The whole continent's ecology would suffer. Climate change and radioactivity will make many species extinct. And this is not taking into account the tens of thousands of animals killed from the initial blast. Even a small-scale use of some 100 nuclear weapons against urban targets would, in addition to spreading radiation around the world, lead to a cooling of the atmosphere, shorter growing seasons, food shortages, and global famine. Rebuilding infrastructure and regrowing the economy will take many decades. This includes trade, communications, healthcare, and schools. This is one scenario of what might happen if we don't stop dictatorships such as Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. Nuclear weapons pose an existential threat to humanity. Their use has devastating consequences. It leads to massive loss of life, environmental harm, and long-term health risks. Over the past 30 years, world leaders and advocates have recognized these threats and made immense efforts to reduce nuclear arsenals. At the peak of the Cold War in the mid-80s, the world had a combined total of over 60,000 nuclear warheads. Today, that number is closer to 15,000, representing a 75% reduction. Two nations, Ukraine and South Africa, gave up their nuclear arsenals in the hope of stepping away even further from the cliff of nuclear war. Unfortunately, signing treaties does not help against those who break the rules. Ukraine is a real-world case. The country willingly gave up the world's third nuclear arsenal in exchange for security. Now, this country is being invaded by the one of the countries that signed up to protect it. Russia invaded Ukraine because its own nuclear arsenal kept it safe. In contrast, Ukraine had no nuclear weapons. It had no way to protect itself and prevent the Russian invasion. There will always be countries like Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea who are willing to break the rules for their benefit. One country having nukes is enough. It can then dictate world politics with the nuclear threat. We can't just all move to Mars to escape the threat. In order to save our homes and the planet, we have to act. The best thing we could do, and it's in our power, is to stop the aggressor state before it comes to nuclear war. We could show them that the cost of aggression would be devastating, thus taking from them the desire to attack. Pacifying the aggressor would be the most terrible mistake we could ever make. The aggressor countries are just like bullies. If they see a weakness in someone, they will hit there as hard as they can. Our goal is not to withdraw from responding to a nuclear attack, but to make sure the first attack would never happen. If we let even a single nuke go off, it could turn into a vicious cycle that might lead to total extinction. We must show aggressors that we are not afraid, and that any aggression would be met with a devastating response. Not standing up to aggressor countries led to tens of millions of deaths in 1940s. Now, with the incredible development of nuclear technologies and precision weapons, the very existence of humanity itself is at stake. Back then, after World War II, everyone understood that we were standing on the very edge. And we cannot let it happen ever again. We must do everything we can to prevent the world from descending into nuclear war.